Welcome. I'm Larry Olsen, and this is the BrainVault Podcast. Did you know that the thoughts you're thinking right now are shaping the life you'll live tomorrow? Well, in this podcast, we just don't talk about mindset. We decode the blueprint behind behavior, performance, and possibility. This is where science meets real-world strategy, and your brain stops running on autopilot. If you're ready to turn default thinking into intentional living, you're in the right place. Well, welcome to BrainVault Podcast, where science meets success, and we show you how to wire both into your life. Now, what happens when a young leader steps into the spotlight and not only earns respect, but also writes the playbook for success? Well, that's the story of today's guest, Scott Stirrett, a best-selling author and rising force in leadership. Scott is proof that influence isn't about age. What is it about? It's about insight, action, and impact. Now get ready to hear a fresh perspective that will change how you think about leading in today's world. And remember, you already know what you know. So open up and listen for a whole new fresh perspective. This is one you're not going to want to miss. So with that being said, welcome, Scott, to the BrainVault Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on.
You're more than welcome, Scott. I got a question for you. You've built a reputation as both a best-selling author and a young leader. Can you take us back to a defining moment where you realized you weren't just leading for yourself, but actually influencing others?
When I was 22, I quit my job at Goldman Sachs in New York City to go found a Venture for Canada, which is a not-for-profit today that has almost a $15 million annual budget, but it didn't start that way. Initially, I was building Venture for Canada from an empty apartment in Toronto, and it was a grind the first couple of years. And around 2 years into my journey of building Venture for Canada, I remember the fellow graduation event, and it was the first fellow graduation of Venture for Canada. The Venture for Canada Fellowship Program, for context, was our initial program. And we had spent 2 years working with this cohort, and we had a valedictorian speaker just talk about the extent to which Venture for Canada had transformed his life, had helped him think bigger, had helped him develop some of the closest friendships of his life. And sitting there in that room amongst all of these people who we had helped, it made me realize that Venture for Canada is a force for helping others achieve their full potential. And when I think about my own mission in life, it's to help others be better versions of themselves. Because I think the more that you as a leader help other people achieve their goals, the more that you're making a lasting mark on this world.
Now, when did you see yourself interested in leadership? How young do you think you were?
I'd say I was a teenager when I first started to become more interested in leadership. When I was in middle school, I was really active in competitive debate, and I was a member of the National Canadian High School debating team. I've represented Canada in Peru and in Germany, and that presented an amazing leadership experience for me in competing against bright Canadians from across the country, but also other young people from around the world. And it taught me critical thinking. It taught me the ability to communicate more effectively. And it taught me teamwork, because in most debates, the debates we were participating in, you have a team. And it taught me that leadership isn't about shining as an individual. It's about winning as a team. And yes, you get individual scores in debating, but what matters the most is, does your team win? And it was a testament that, to me, leadership at the core is about teamwork, and how can individuals working together accomplish more than if they were working together separately.
So it sounds like you weren't suffering from the ego side of can take over and blind us to the fact that there's a group of individuals that would like to share the spotlight as well. Um, was it your parenting, or where do you think it stemmed from that you had kind of this generative nature?
I have a lot of great entrepreneurial role models in my family. My father founded a very successful business and saw firsthand his leadership and how he's built a great company of which many people have spent 20, 30 years of their life working in. And is a testament to the fact that I think he's a really good people manager. But also my grandfather on my mom's side, who also is a very successful entrepreneur, built a really large business and I think also a kind person. And I think for many people, your family members or your close family friends are can influence you significantly and can ch change your perception of leadership. And certainly that was my case.
Well, I'm going to back you up a little bit before we get into it here, even in more detail. When I was growing up, we were the first family on the block to have TV trays. So we'd sit in front of the television, and there wasn't a lot of influence as relative to what do you plan on doing with your life. Even though both of my parents were very loving and quite successful, what kind of conversations would you have around the table?
About a variety of topics, often about Canadian politics. I love politics since I was a little kid. It's one of the reasons I left Canada for university and I chose to study at Georgetown at the School of Foreign Service. Is I love international relations. I love foreign affairs. I love politics, and we'd often talk about politics. We'd talk about geography. We would talk about business. I'm an only child, and from an early stage, I was exposed to a lot of like more adult kind of conversations about the state of the world and about how to be a leader.
Let me ask you this. A lot of people find that without knowing it, that politics blinds them to being open to other points of view. How did you keep that from happening to you?
One formative thing in my life was participating in competitive debate. And when you participate in competitive debate, you are assigned a side to argue. And in most cases, you have to argue both sides. And I think when you participate in competitive debate, it can make you a little less stubborn when it comes to talking about key issues because you begin to realize that most major policy decisions, most major decisions in the world are about trade-offs. And there are pros and cons to both sides of the argument. And it also helps you distinguish between disagreeing with someone on policy and thinking they're like a bad person. And for that reason, I think competitive debate is a really excellent exercise for many people. I actually wrote an op-ed for Canada's largest newspaper on this topic about how teaching debate skills is integral to enhancing democracy. Because the more that you have people who can argue both sides, the more you can have people who can have respectful, productive debates.
Very nice, very nice. Yeah, and then you're really allowing yourself to calm the amygdala and be able to open the cerebral cortex to actually reason and think futuristic as opposed to just trying to make sure that you're right. And how do you deal when you are out there raising money or getting people to join the mission um, to make sure that you put yourself in a position where you're when you do confront someone who's a little, let's say, bullheaded relative to making sure they're right, what have you found a good technique to help them move beyond that without, needless to say, a technique that a lot of people use, which isn't very effective, is boy, you're sure not very open-minded, thinking that somehow that's going to enlighten somebody. What have you found that works to help people who are stubborn like that to be able to open up and see other perspectives?
Two different things. The first one is sometimes being aware of when it doesn't make sense to argue with someone. If someone is extremely emotional about a subject or really argumentative, it likely doesn't even make sense to engage with them in certain contexts. So that's the first, is that figure out when is it productive for you to engage, and if it's not productive, just don't engage in the conversation about it. Shift to a different subject. That's
Yeah.
the first piece of advice. The second piece of advice that I would have is, if you think that someone is relatively open-minded and respectful to have a conversation, it's to seek to understand where that person is coming from rather than to debate them. I think the more that you understand their point of view, even if you don't agree with it, the more you can have a respectful dialogue than immediately going and explaining this is why you're wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that something? You know, that's such a powerful tool and insight for all of us is we're so quick. I mean, the brain's designed for predictability, and the brain wants to be right because that maintains our self-image and our perception of the world and how we think it should be, we should operate within it and how it should operate. And that whole ability to be able to step back and see where someone's coming from can often allow you the opportunity to recognize, just as you said, whether you're trying to reason with the unreasonable, or whether or not you find some common elements that you both agree with that can be expanded upon. Um, what is the most exciting part of the work that you do for you?
I think the most exciting aspect of my work is seeing the direct impact that I have on other people. There are many people I met who, without the work of Venture for Canada myself, they wouldn't have become entrepreneurs. Their lives would have been very different. They wouldn't have met their spouse. They wouldn't have had kids. There are so many different ways that the work that I've done at Venture for Canada has made a significant impact on the rest of a lot of other people. I always, as a child, loved the It's a Wonderful Life movie. And at the end, or towards the end, he sees this world of what would have happened if he had never, if he had, was it died as a child, or if he hadn't become like an
Right.
adult. And it's so much worse off. And I think it's an interesting question to ask yourself, like, if I didn't exist, how would the world be different?
Mm.
And I think for me, that's what's been really inspiring about my work, is I know concretely in so many different ways that the work of Venture for Canada has materially positively impacted other people in terms of increasing their willingness to take risks, to bet on themselves, to build a better life for themselves, their family, their community.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, let's talk about a lot of people experience the vision, the goal that they want to accomplish. And then as the journey begins, there's some roadblocks that not only discourage but set them back, and they begin to question themselves. You know, is this the right track we're on? Is this something that really we should continue to aspire to? Because it seems like we have one obstacle after another. How do you help people not get stuck with getting so focused on the obstacle and losing sight of what it is that why we're doing this to begin with?
Something I talk about in my book, The Uncertainty Advantage, is that there's an epidemic of perfectionism that exists by young people, but a lot of people just in general in our society. And I think so many people focus on outcomes versus what they need to focus on is the journey, because we don't control the outcomes, but we can control the journey. And I think the more that you focus on the journey, a big bump in the road, you reframe it as a learning and say, hey, I've learned a lot from this. I realized this doesn't work. And then it let me go to a new thing. And that's how I view bumps in the road. I think really perfectionistic people struggle with that. They can get completely derailed when there is a setback. So the advice I would have for someone is focus on the journey, not the destination when you have a roadblock.
Okay. So for those listeners who are saying blah, 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 in the sense of It's the journey, not the destination. The kind of the bumper sticker slogan. I really feel and hear what you're saying, but peel the onion a little bit on that. And let's talk about, what do you mean by journey?
What I mean by the journey is I'll talk about the context of building venture for Canada. I've built this organization for 11 and a half years. We've raised over $80 million of funding. We've helped over 10,000 people launch their careers. Now, Venture for Canada is a successful organization by many metrics, but in many points, there was a lot of bumps in this journey. I'll talk about examples in like 2017, around 8 years ago, the organization almost like self-destructed. Like we had a board offsite and there's complaints by a bunch of employees. It was extremely tense. And a lot of people wondered whether this organization was going to keep on going. And that was a huge bump along the road. In 2020, I was diagnosed, or early 2021, I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder and was really struggling with COVID and uncertainty. And that was a huge bump in the road in the journey. There were also high points like that graduation I talked about, like the 10-year celebration of Venture for Canada. There were so many amazing points in the last 11 and a half years. But I think whenever you build anything, particularly if it's like significant, there's going to be ups and downs. And the journey includes those amazing points, it includes those really challenging points. It also includes like a million other points along the road. And you have to reflect more on what did you learn through this 11 and a half years? What was the impact of the work that you did? And don't fixate on, oh, I messed up here. I made this like mistake.
Mm.
What
Mm.
matters more is how can you learn from that mistake? And so I can talk a little bit more about Amy Edmondson's great book, The Right Side of Wrong, of how do you make intelligent failures rather than just make failures for the sake of a failure.
The you mentioned perfectionism, and you really highlighted it, to me anyway. And I really think that one of the biggest challenges we have in understanding one another is, when you're talking to me, you're talking from your perspective, your work, how you relate to the particular terms and words you're using. As I am attempting to understand, I am using my experiences and my definition of the words that you're using. And that's why they say that you hear 100% of what's shared, and if you're really listening, you can pick up 18% or less because of that misinterpretation. And most people, though, they don't follow up and they don't ask what you mean by, they make assumptions that they think they know what you're talking about because it makes sense to their experiences. So, that being said, what does perfectionism mean to you? And what have you seen as the consequences of?
There are three different types of perfectionism that most clinicians define. The first is other-oriented perfectionism. So caring a lot about what other people think about that can often be about like appearance or like driving the right kind of like car. Um, the one of the other type of perfectionism is when you have a huge amount of perfectionism on yourself. So you have it's kind of from your own internal desire to just be perfect all the time. And the third type of perfectionism is when it's about getting caring about other people being perfect all the time. So it could be your kids, your spouse. And I think it's important to ground this definition of perfectionism in those three major types, which are what most clinicians in the mental health space kind of break perfectionism into. And some of the symptoms of perfectionism include one is the ability to get completely derailed by like failures or even small particularly if like a small setback completely like ruins your day, then you're potentially a perfectionist. Perfectionists also tend to
Somebody spilling coffee on their favorite shirt.
exactly, yeah, that's a perfect example. Focusing more on the destination rather than the journey. is another symptom of perfectionism. Taking way too long to do a basic thing. And that's something that a lot of young people struggle with is
I got to
that,
do it perfect, right?
yeah, it has to be perfect versus perfect is the enemy of the good. In our world, sometimes it's about just like getting stuff out. And sometimes you aren't going to do a perfect job, and that's like okay. And so that's what perfectionism looks like, Larry. In terms of it can manifest itself in many different kinds of ways. It can be there's perfectionists at work, there's perfectionists in sports, and in some ways, our society demands perfection from a lot of people.
Ah,
It's important to not blame young people or individuals for perfectionism, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there are some broader trends that resulted in why we have this epidemic of perfectionism today. I think it's everything from overly invasive parenting that puts really high pressures on children, to the rise of social media, to broader like neoliberal trends, I think, in the world where there's a huge emphasis on competition and beating other people. And I
mm,
think all of these things contributed to why in the last 30 years across Canada, the US, UK, and many countries, data has shown that the young people today are significantly more perfectionistic than they were 30 years ago.
mm,
And that is a huge driver of the mental health issues that we have today.
yeah.
Because when you're a perfectionist, you're more brittle, you're more vulnerable. And I share this from the experience of that at times I can be a perfectionist. And I think some of the mental health challenges that I experienced in the past were really closely tied with my tendency to be really perfectionistic in some cases.
That's obsessive compulsive behavior.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, there's a strong link between perfectionism and OCD.
Yeah, gotcha, gotcha. Um, when you're talking about this whole element of perfectionism, it's really interesting. I'm a firm believer that it's not what happens to us, but how we talk to ourselves about what happens to us that determines ultimately our emotional state, our cognitive state. And what I wanted to ask you, for instance, I got really pumped when we hit 150,000 followers. And then I saw somebody with 2 million followers. And immediately I had to really check myself because at first there was a hit of disappointment. Um, and no longer was there any celebration of the accomplishment and what it took to get up to that milestone in our growth. And it really reminds me of that whole element of comparison. And I think there's two things that really can set us back, and that's judgment and comparison. And I wanted to find out from you because we're all pretty judgmental. First paper we got back in school had everything circled in red we did wrong, except you probably didn't have as many wrong as I did, um,
No, I
which
love.
is a comparison. You follow me?
Yeah.
So, no pun intended on that. But I wanted you to just for a moment, how have you skirted dealing with those two fundamental issues? Because you talked about perfectionism as being an epidemic. And I wanted to know what you meant by that. But I'd also like you to talk about a little bit about how you see judgment and comparison coming in and their role in that as well, both positive and negative, if you don't mind.
Perfectionism is an epidemic in the sense that studies show that young people today are, I think, approximately 30% more perfectionist or like in a sort of diagnosable way than they were 30 years ago. And the epidemic is that it is way more prevalent today for a young person to be a perfectionist than it was even in like the early 1990s. Judgment and comparison is a huge part of perfectionism because so much of it is often comparing yourself to other people or this ideal. That's where the social media can tie in, and people see, oh, that person has 2 million followers. That person got more likes than me. That person's life is so amazing. That person looks so beautiful. And that's where social media, I think, and Jonathan Haidt and lots of people have written about this, can really contribute to this epidemic of perfectionism that young people have. What's really important for like a listener is to label your tendency to compare yourself to other people and to be, it's like deep in our psyche to compare ourselves with other people. We are social animals, and that means we are comparative animals. And it's okay, I actually think, for someone to compare themselves to another person. Um, in the sense that I think it's almost like it's something we're inevitably all going to do. But then it's to sort of reframe and be like, okay, that's my like natural instinct to compare myself with another person come in. That's not necessarily healthy. And even in me, like I'll share to wrap it up is that like when I was younger, I in my early 20s, I remember kind of obsessively, compulsively like checking specific people and what they were doing and comparing myself to those people on like an almost like daily basis.
Hmm.
And I realize now, like in retrospect, that was like unhealthy. It was OCD behavior. But also, I think that a lot of people do that even if they don't have OCD, is
Yeah.
that they'll sometimes fixate on a few people and really compare themselves to that. In your case, it might be like who you view as your biggest kind of competitors in the context of your podcast. And the advice I'd have for someone is one, be mindful, be aware of when you're getting into this comparative behavior and reframe and gently kind of nudge yourself to say, hey, that's not great behavior to do. And the second is to say the most important competition is with yourself.
Hmm.
So how are you growing your sales or how are you growing your awareness? And am I better today than I was a year ago? It's because you can control competing against yourself. You can't control competing against other people.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, that answer is for us what these people can do out there who are feeling kind of stuck or maybe a little down on themselves is great insights and advice on that. How do people go about getting a hold of you and finding out more, get your book, etc.? Because you've really got a lot of wisdom for someone who hasn't been on the planet that long, but that's relative too, and that's a comparison as well. Um, how do people go ahead and get a hold of you, Scott?
Folks can learn more about me by visiting my website, stirrett.com, STI, two R's, E, two T's.com. You can also check out my book called The Uncertainty Advantage on Amazon.com. It's available on September 16th in the US, available for pre-order as of today. And it's also sold at Barnes& and Noble, independent bookstores across the United States. And lastly, you can check me out on Substack, where I send out an email once a month that contains personal stories, advice, tools to help people navigate uncertainty and ultimately learn to thrive in the chaotic world that we live in that poses a lot of challenges, but also contains so many opportunities.
Beautiful, beautiful. As so well said, between uncertainty advantage. Nice, nice juxtaposition between two interesting terms that sometimes aren't in harmony. Um, but they'll find out how to do more of that by reading it and get a hold of you. It's been fascinating, and I want to just give you kudos for being so well grounded. And I can see where that debate experience, plus your amazing intellect, has really assisted you in bringing clarity through the chaos for those that are a bit confused or overwhelmed on how to put things back into perspective again. I want to ask you one more question here, and I
Perfect.
think we're in good timing, aren't we, so far?
Yeah, I think we're all good. It's 4:06, so we have plenty of time.
Okay, good, good. I wanted to take a moment with you, and I wanted to ask Scott a question that I think all of us are dealing with as we fight these judgments and comparisons that constantly go on our mind, continually asking ourselves and telling ourselves, how am I doing? And why did that happen? What I do about this? And sometimes we get a little worked up. We start pumping cortisol into our system, and we begin to get a little unhealthy, and we stop enjoying the journey. and if only those outcomes would occur, then I'd be really enjoying my life. One of the things that I wanted Scott to address is our brain was designed to live in a tribe, to deal with maybe 50 people. Now with social media, and this is a bit of an exaggeration, but it's 8 billion. And it's just a bit overwhelming for the brain, but when we don't know any better, we think that there's something going on with us, something wrong with us, that we're feeling good about it with all the dopamine hits we got, but now it's starting to take a toll. And as I shared earlier with Scott, when I saw we had over 150,000 followers and then saw somebody else with 2 million, that joy immediately evaporated because of this whole thing. Scott, share with us your insights as to how we deal with the fact that we're designed to be able to deal comfortably with maybe 50 people. And now we're just basically overwhelmed with all the resources that we have that we sometimes end up finding ourselves falling short of instead of learning from.
Yeah, it's a great point. And when you think of when we were cave people wandering around the world, you would sometimes only know like 10, 20, 30 people, like not very many people at all. And today we can interact with thousands and we have the opportunity to potentially meet millions of people online. And that can be challenging from a comparison perspective, but also I think in the sense of there are so many opportunities out there that people can get pulled in many different directions as well. And one of the things I talk about in my book, The Uncertainty Advantage, is the importance of being adaptable in your planning. So that means not being too rigid and saying, this is what I want to do in 1 year, this is what I want to do in 2 years, etc. But it is thinking about what is your true north that you want to accomplish. And in doing so, what you should do is think about what is your like personal mission statement in life. So many people go through life and they don't think about like why. Like, why do I exist? 6 or 7 years ago, I did that for myself and I created the mission statement, help others achieve their full potential. And it's a strong kind of guiding light for me. Likewise, I went through a process of thinking around what are my core values, and I came to integrity, inclusiveness, curiosity, and ambition. And the advice that I would have for people in navigating this world where there's so many people and so many opportunities, and you can get distracted so easily, is to think back to your mission, think back to your values, and to be focused. And I think there's so many people out there who can sometimes squander their potential through not being focused. And as Bill Gates once said, people overestimate what they can do in 3, they underestimate what they can do in 10. And I think when you're focused to the true north of what you're trying to accomplish, you can cut out the distractions and you can learn to embrace the uncertainty out there in the world and to truly turn uncertainty into an advantage in your life.
Beautiful. Wow, that's beautiful. Um, this, as you were saying, I was going to ask you, there's a lot of people that have no idea what their mission is. Um, when I'm talking to individuals, I tell them first off, do you have any idea what the odds of being alive are? And you go online and it's pretty consistent. It's 1 in 400 trillion. Now, as an intelligent man, you know that most people would say that's zero. And yet here we are. And and if you're not feeling good about yourself, you're not a cosmic joke. You don't put 100 billion neurons into someone each capable of processing 3 to 5 million bits of information and not set them up to be tremendously successful. But then we pop out of the womb and we start listening to people and we start talking to ourselves and attempting to formulate where are we in this whole thing. And we lose sight of, and maybe we've never had the opportunity to really articulate to ourselves what our mission is. What is it we want to accomplish while we're here in this thing called life? And I mine was put together years ago, which is to raise the self-esteem of the human race one person at a time. And I love yours because it's like, where they're very similar. We're like kindred spirits in what we're attempting to accomplish. what would you say some first steps are for people to find their mission, to be able to sit down and articulate it?
The first is to start writing. Take a notebook and create like 30 different mission statements for yourself. Think about what are the things that have brought the most like joy to you in your life, but also like what are the things where you've been like useful to other people, where you've been like effective. Think it through like the Ikigai framework, which is like what is something that helps other people. You can make an income. You are good at and that you like. And I think apply that framework in the context of creating like a mission statement for yourself. Then go like start pruning like words. So initially mission statement you might have a draft that's quite long. Make it as like short and concise as like possible. So mine is help others achieve their full potential. When you look at corporations and they generally tend to not have giant mission statements that are like 10 sentences long. Their values can be really long, but their mission statements often are pretty concise. And the advice that I would have for someone is think of, write a lot of things out on paper and gradually narrow it into something that's really concise, that resonates with you, and that you think it can pull together a lot of the disparate things in your life and can be a true north in calling for you for the coming decades.
Beautiful, beautiful. And if you would, please define, I know what you mean, but do I know what you mean by true north, or do I know what I mean by true north? So Scott, please articulate and peel the onion a little bit on what true north, what does that mean when you use that?
What I mean by true north is what is the direction that you're looking to go to. So if you're like out in the woods and you're trying to go north, what is your general direction in life? And I think that's the thing about a mission statement is it's not being extremely prescriptive about yourself. It's not saying my mission is to make $1 million by the time I'm 50 and blah 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 blah. What it is it's saying this is the high level of what I'm trying to do. And within North, there's a lot of different directions you can sometimes like go. So that's what I mean by true North.
I like it. And I also believe mission is something that you may not accomplish, probably won't accomplish in your life. Um, but along the way, you know why it is you're doing what you're doing. And it is a real nice filter system to help you stay on track, which I understand as true north. And then you can make decisions if you want to go south and east and west, but you don't know what south and east and west is if you don't know north. So it really helps center us and it becomes an anchor. Um, what would you like to, what would you, I put this into a direction based on my curiosity about who you are and how you got involved in this. What would you like to articulate that maybe is something that I didn't ask you about, is lying dormant, and yet it's such a part of who you are that we can leave with our audience?
A core part of the uncertainty advantage is the importance of self-compassion. We live in an uncertain, chaotic world where adverse things can happen to us really quickly and where our plans can get thrown out really fast. And I believe that in a world defined by rapid change, you need to be compassionate to yourself. And what does that mean? It means talking to yourself in a nice way. It means being mindful of your emotions. It means recognizing that when you're suffering, it's part of a broader shared suffering that exists in the world. And I think a lot of people, because of this epidemic of perfectionism that we talked about, can be so hard on themselves. And the final advice I'd have for a listener is foster self-compassion. Particularly if you're an ambitious entrepreneurial person, I think so many people in this category can self-sabotage themselves by being too hard on themselves. And that's not saying being a slacker, but how can you have healthy striving? How can you focus more on the journey rather than the destination, but still do great things? And I think ultimately it's the people who make the biggest impact in the world. They're very ambitious, but they're also very self-compassionate because they recognize that no one is perfect. we all make mistakes, and that it's through learning through these mistakes, it's through embracing the change and the wonder of life, including the bad things and the good things, that we make a tremendous impact on the world.
Beautiful, beautiful, very well said. And when you said we all make mistakes, I thought of the fact that we could add something to that, but we're not a mistake. And I think that's where that self-compassion you're talking about is so important. What a pleasure to have you on and sharing with me. I want you to know that you've exceeded my expectations. And I generally set the bar pretty high. So kudos for the work you're doing, for the mission that you have, and for the insights you've shared with all of us so that we can begin to see how remarkable we are and how to make a positive impact in this once in a lifetime opportunity we have right now. So Scott, kudos and thank you for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me on.
You bet. And thank you all for tuning in, and look forward to seeing who we've got next. Take care, everybody.